You haven't seen land in 6 weeks. Your water tastes like the barrel it's been sitting in. Your bread is starting to move on its own. And every man around you is doing the math in his head, over and over, wondering if the ocean just keeps going forever. This wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday. For the crew of the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. Somewhere in the middle of an ocean nobody on board had ever crossed. By the first week of October 1492, Christopher Columbus's 3 ships had been sailing west for longer than any European sailor had gone without sighting land. No maps, no radio, no way to call for help. Just wind, water, and the growing suspicion that they'd made a terrible mistake. So how did they actually survive it? Not with luck. With a set of hard, practical systems for food, for water, for navigation, and for keeping 60 desperate men from turning on their captain. And the record of exactly how they did it still exists, because Columbus wrote almost all of it down himself. Start with the food, because food was the clock the whole voyage ran on. A 15th century Spanish caravel like the Nina carried salted meat, dried fish, hard biscuit called ship's biscuit, olive oil, wine, cheese, and beans. Nothing fresh. Nothing that could spoil quickly, because nothing could be replaced once you left port. The wine and water were rationed by the cup, measured out by an officer, because a man who drank freely in week 1 could be begging by week 5. The biscuit is the part people don't expect. It was baked twice. That's what biscuit actually means. From the Latin for twice cooked, until it was hard enough to survive months at sea without going soft. Sailors softened it in wine or soup before eating it. And yes, it got weevils. Small beetles that burrowed into the dry biscuit and had to be tapped out or eaten along with it, because there was no version of this voyage where you could afford to throw food away. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who literally sailed a replica of Columbus's route across the Atlantic in the 1930s to understand the navigation firsthand, documented just how tight these margins were. His research showed a caravel this size carried barely enough stores for a few months, which meant every single day at sea was a day closer to a supply problem nobody could solve by turning around, because turning around used just as many supplies as pushing forward. Water was the tighter constraint. A grown man doing hard physical labor in salt air and full sun needs several liters a day just to function. The ships carried what they could in wooden casks, and casks leak, sweat, and pick up the taste of whatever they held before. Officers watched the water level the way a modern accountant watches a budget that's about to run out before payday. Rain, when it came, wasn't an inconvenience. It was a resource. Sailors caught what they could in sailcloth and emptied it into anything that would hold it, because there was no other source between one coastline and the next. Now picture a normal afternoon. You're on deck. The sun is directly overhead, which is actually useful. It's how the ship's pilot estimates latitude using an instrument called a quadrant to measure the sun's angle above the horizon. No satellites, no GPS, just angles, a chart, and a guess corrected by experience. Below deck, someone is portioning out the evening's bread ration into equal shares, because equal shares are what keeps 60 tired, frightened men from turning their fear into anger. On the open deck, another sailor is coiling rope that's damp from salt spray, because damp rope rots, and rotten rope kills a ship faster than any storm. There's no privacy. There's barely room to lie down. Men slept wherever there was space, on deck, against cargo, wrapped in whatever they had, because these ships had no dedicated crew quarters the way later vessels would. And there was no such thing as a day off. The wind didn't take weekends. 3 ships also meant 3 different experiences of the same crossing. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was the largest and slowest, a heavier cargo vessel called a nao. The Pinta and the Nina were smaller, faster caravels, built for speed and easier to handle in shifting wind. Sailing 3 ships together across open ocean meant constant signaling between them. Flags by day, lanterns by night, so that no single crew ever drifted out of sight of the others in the dark. Losing sight of the other 2 ships wasn't just lonely. It was dangerous, because a ship that vanished from formation might never be found again. Here's the detail that surprises most people. The biggest danger wasn't the ocean itself, it was the crew. By early October, more than a month in, some of the men were done. Not tired, done. They'd signed on expecting a shorter voyage, and Columbus's own journal, later summarized by the Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas, who transcribed and preserved large portions of it, records rising talk among the crew of turning back, and even, according to some accounts, of throwing Columbus overboard and reporting he'd simply been lost at sea. Columbus's answer wasn't to threaten them into silence. It was to manage the information itself. He kept two separate distance logs, one accurate for himself and one that showed a shorter distance traveled for the crew. The idea was simple. If the men believed they hadn't sailed as far from Spain as they actually had, they'd feel closer to turning back safely and less likely to panic. Whether every detail of that story survived exactly as written is debated by historians, but the core strategy, controlling what the crew knew to control what the crew feared, lines up with how Columbus managed morale throughout the log. He also read the ocean itself for hope and made sure the crew saw him do it. Floating branches, a carved stick, birds flying in a consistent direction, which sailors knew meant land was near, because birds don't fly out over open ocean for no reason. Each sign got pointed out, discussed, logged. Not because Columbus was certain what it meant, but because uncertainty, managed out loud, is easier to survive than uncertainty in silence. By October 10th, the tension had a name. Crews on more than one ship were reportedly close to open revolt, and Columbus, according to his own account, made a specific promise. A few more days. Just a few more days, and if land didn't appear, they'd discuss turning home. 2 days later, at around 2 in the morning on October 12th, a sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana saw it. Land. It's worth pausing on what that moment actually was. Not a triumphant arrival at a known destination. A group of exhausted, dehydrated, frightened men, seeing a dark line on the horizon after 5 weeks of believing it might never come. The relief in Columbus's log entry from that night is not flowery. It's exhausted. The land they'd reached was an island in the Bahamas that Columbus named San Salvador, believed by most historians today to be the island now known as Guanahani to its original Lucayan inhabitants, who were already living there and had been for centuries. Columbus hadn't discovered an empty ocean. He'd survived a crossing and arrived somewhere that was already someone else's home. That's the twist most versions of this story leave out. The 6 weeks weren't a story about conquering nature. They were a story about a small group of underfed, underslept, terrified men holding together, barely, through rationing, routine, and a captain who understood that managing fear was just as important as managing wind and water. And it ended not at an empty finish line, but at the beginning of contact with people who had their own systems, their own knowledge of these waters, and their own version of what happened next. You've probably never rationed your last cup of drinking water or gone 5 weeks without solid ground under your feet, but you felt some version of that same private math the crew was doing. The moment where you don't know if the plan is working, and all you can do is keep the routine going one more day and see what the horizon gives you. 6 weeks without seeing land wasn't survived by the strongest man on board or the bravest. It was survived by the ones who kept measuring the sun, kept portioning the bread, and kept believing, or at least kept acting like they believed, that land was still out there, one more sunrise away.